Have you ever wondered what kind of fire could speak to heaven? Not the fire that destroys, not the fire that warms, but the fire that remembers where it came from. The fire that knows the voice of God. The fire that bowed down not to wind, nor rain, nor famine, but to the silence between thunder and breath. There was once a man who carried that fire. He did not come from royalty, nor was he sent by scholars. He was born of dust, raised by wilderness, and whispered to by winds that remembered Eden. He walked barefoot through lands cursed by drought, spoke to kings who trembled, and outran chariots with his spirit alone. His name meant, "My God is the Lord," and every word he uttered cracked the heavens like dry stone. He did not die. He was taken, carried not in body but in flame to the place where thunders speak only in riddles and the stars bow low when prophets rise. This is the story the dust still remembers. This is the name the mountains whisper before rain. This is the fire that knew no grave, Elijah. If your soul has ever burned with a question that felt too ancient to explain, if something in your spirit still waits for fire to fall again, then stay close. This was meant for you to hear. Subscribe and walk with us now into the wilderness of prophecy. The sky forgot how to rain. Clouds passed like shadows without promise, their bellies swollen with silence. Fields turned to dust and dust to despair. Children cried into the arms of mothers who no longer had lullabies, only dry lips and empty bowls. The wells remembered water, but only as a dream they could no longer explain. And still the people bowed, not to the one who spoke at Sinai, but to carved mouths that could not answer. Their hands bled from building altars of stone that had never pulsed with life, while incense rose to gods who never walked in Eden. Baal had become their sun, but he gave no warmth. Asherah their moon, but she sang no songs. And in the hollow of that drought, not just of rain, but of reverence, heaven did not scream. It whispered. Somewhere beyond the cracked hills and the shriveled vines, in a place too quiet for kings to notice, a name stirred in the breath between stars. Not born of bloodlines, not trained in courtly wisdom, not cloaked in priestly robes, but seen, chosen, summoned by the God who hides prophets in silence until the world aches for their voice. Elijah. The name moved like wind through cedar. My God is the Lord. Not a question, not a negotiation. A declaration carved in soul, not stone. The boy who would one day stand before altars of fire was, for now, just a man unknown by the earth but known by the sky. And God, who had once called Moses from flame and Samuel from sleep, now called Elijah not with thunder but with a drought. He rose not by command of men but by an ache in his bones. His steps were not rehearsed, they were remembered as if he had walked this path before the world had names. Through villages starved of rain and hearts starved of truth, Elijah walked like a living warning, and every footprint was a sermon. He did not come to explain, he came to announce that heaven was not amused, that the silence of rain was a message, that even the sky obeys when God grows weary of waiting. He came to Ahab not with weapons but with words, and the words were heavier than swords. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except at my word. He said it, then vanished like a spark dropped in a field of dry grass. The king blinked, the courtiers whispered, but the sky did not blink, and the clouds did not speak. For the drought was no longer just a forecast, it was a decree, and behind it walked the man whose prayers could open and close the heavens, not because he was powerful, but because he was obedient. Elijah, clothed not in gold but in wilderness, became the prophet whose silence was louder than thunder. He was a man like us, Scripture would later say, but no one who saw him believed he was only a man. There was something in his eyes like someone who had seen too much of heaven and was now ruined for earth. Something in his breath like wind had lived inside his lungs. Something in his stillness like even time bowed when he paused. And then God spoke again, not in scrolls or in songs, but in direction. Go, hide. The one who had just closed the sky was now told to disappear. For this is the rhythm of fire, it reveals, then it retreats. Elijah was not sent to the temple. He was not given a throne. He was led to a brook, a hidden one beneath the lip of the land where only birds and stars would know his name. Chariot, the cutting place. And there he would wait, drink from silence, eat what ravens carried in their beaks, and remember that even prophets must be fed by the wild. The drought deepened. The idols remained mute. And in the stillness a fire began to grow, not in the sky, not in the land, but in the Ma. And the brook did not sing, but it breathed. Soft trickles weaving through stone like threads of forgotten music, hidden from the eyes of men. Chariot, the place where heaven hides what it cherishes. There between rock and silence, Elijah drank not just water but waiting. The prophet of flame was now a student of slowness. For even fire must first learn to smolder before it speaks. The days passed without thunder. The wind moved but without direction. No vision came in dreams. No voice from the whirlwind. Only ravens, black-winged and timely, arriving with bread as if the wilderness still remembered Eden's laws. Bread in the morning, meat in the dusk. Their wings sliced through drought as if death could be postponed by obedience. And Elijah, seated in stillness, began to listen not for prophecy but for presence. His hunger was not for food but for the next word from God. This was not punishment. This was preparation. The silence was not absent. It was an alignment. For when a man has nothing and still obeys, the heavens watch more closely. The brook gurgled like a whisper between realms, and every night Elijah looked up at a sky so dry it crackled, wondering not when the rain would return but when the people would remember. Elsewhere Ahab raged. Jezebel fed her altars with blood. The prophets of Baal multiplied like weeds in a forgotten garden. But in the hidden place a man prayed without words. He did not ask for vengeance. He did not plead for power, he only waited, and heaven noticed, for faith is not proved by flame falling from above. It is proved when nothing falls at all and still you bow. The drought thickened, the land cracked. Mothers clutched babies who coughed like dust, and still Elijah did not move. He would not move until God did, but heaven, though slow, is never absent. And the moment came soft as a shadow, the brook slowed. Each day less water sang. The silence grew heavier. The birds began to visit less. And Elijah, the man who had watched kings tremble, now watched as the last drop of the brook he'd been given faded into earth. No panic, no fear, only understanding. When God dries the brook, it is never to kill the prophet, it is to move the fire. Arise, the voice said, this time without thunder. Go to Zarephath. I have commanded a widow there to feed you. A widow, not a prince, not a priest. A woman without power, without certainty, whose hands held dust and whose heart held grief. Elijah obeyed. He always obeyed. And so he left the shelter of Chariot with no map but trust. Step by step through the scorched lands, past towns that smelled of hunger and idols, until he reached the edge of Sidon's territory, a land ruled by the very queen who hunted him. A place drenched in idolatry, where Baal was not just worshipped, but woven into the air. And there at the gate of the city he saw her, thin, dust on her face, gathering sticks as if she were preparing her soul to lay down beside her child. She did not look like a miracle, but neither had the brook, and neither had the ravens. Bring me a little water, he said, his voice cracking like the land. And as she turned to go, he added, and a morsel of bread in your hand. She paused, eyes hollow with truth. As the Lord your God lives, she whispered, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks so that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die. Her words did not tremble. She had passed trembling long ago. Now only resolve remained. But Elijah, who had learned to trust in birds and brooks, looked at her with the calm of one who knows what heaven can multiply. Do not fear, he said. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth. The silence that followed was holy, not because it was loud, but because it carried choice. Would she feed the prophet or feed her fear? The air between them held its breath. The sticks trembled in her fingers, not from wind, but from decision. What kind of God, she must have thought, sends a prophet to ask for the last bread from the hands of a mother? What kind of Lord hides provision in emptiness? But Elijah's eyes did not plead. They knew something deeper. He had seen the ravens come. He had seen the brook hold water long after the land was forgotten. He had heard the voice that speaks in famine, and he recognized this moment not as a test, but as a turning point. And somehow in that silence, so did she. She turned without another word and walked into her home, the dust of her robe trailing like a ribbon of surrender behind her. Inside, the house was not a temple, no holy music, no echoing prayers, just the sound of a child breathing shallowly and a jar whispering its emptiness. But the woman moved as though the angels watched. She poured just a little, it was not enough, and yet it became enough. The oil did not complain, the flour did not end. She kneaded, shaped, and baked. The scent rose like incense, though no altar stood in that house. She returned and placed the small cake in the hands of the prophet, and in that moment, heaven bowed, not because the bread was large, but because the faith was. Elijah ate and said nothing. Some miracles are too sacred for words, but when she returned to her jar, she saw it still full, and the jug still glistening with oil. Her eyes widened, not with disbelief, but with a reverence that only hunger can teach. Day after day, the miracle repeated. The flour did not fail. The oil did not retreat. The prophet, the widow, and the child, they lived, not because the land was kind, but because obedience opens what drought cannot close. God had not filled a palace with plenty. He had hidden abundance in the kitchen of a forgotten woman in a foreign land beyond the reach of kings. And each morning when she saw the jar, she remembered, God does not need excess, only trust, but miracles do not make us immune to sorrow. One morning the child did not rise, his breath stilled, his eyes closed, and the silence in that house became a wound. The woman's cries cracked the walls. She looked at Elijah with the anguish only a mother can know. What have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son? Her voice shook with more than grief, it trembled with the echo of every human question hurled into the sky. Why? Why after all this? Why after I believed? Elijah said nothing. He took the boy from her arms that had once held hope, now heavy with loss, and climbed the stairs to the upper room. He laid the child on his own bed, then fell upon him, not with ritual, not with words from scrolls, but with groans that reached beyond the veil. O Lord my God, Elijah cried, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son? O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. 3 times he stretched himself out, and 3 times he cried, not for fire this time, but for breath. And heaven, which had withheld rain, did not withhold mercy. The child stirred. The soul returned. The breath broke through the silence. Elijah lifted him, warm now, weighty with life, and descended the stairs not like a prophet, but like a servant of compassion. See, he said, placing the boy into his mother's arms, your son lives. And the woman wept not with confusion, but with clarity. Now I know, she whispered, that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. And still the drought continued. The days folded into each other like the pages of a silent book. Outside, the ground remained thirsty. The trees did not dance. The wells did not rise. The gods of Baal still stood, mute and mocked, their carved mouths never answering, their stone hands never reaching. But inside the widow's home, the jar still poured, the oil still glistened. The child laughed again. And Elijah waited not as one forgotten, but as one hidden by design. For prophets are not always called to speak. Sometimes they are called to listen so long that when they do speak, the heavens cannot ignore them. In the hush of Zarephath, he prayed without speaking. He watched the boy grow stronger, and in the child's breath he heard the echoes of a coming rain. But it was not yet time. Heaven holds its promises like seeds buried until the soil is ready. The prophet's fire had not gone out. It had only grown deeper, waiting for the command that would tear silence in half. And far away, the king still ruled, but not with righteousness. Ahab's reign was built on fear, his queen's own blood. Jezebel fed the mouths of false prophets while silencing the mouths of truth. Altars multiplied, not to worship, but to forget. And the people, caught in the lull of idolatry, forgot how to weep. But God never forgets. He remembers dust, he remembers cries, he remembers every faithful whisper uttered in secret. And one morning, when the oil still shimmered in the widow's jar, the word came. Not loud, not with trumpets, but in the sacred stillness Elijah had come to be recognized as divine. Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. No thunder, no map, no legions of angels, just a direction, and the fire inside the prophet answered. He rose. He thanked the woman who had become a chapter in his sacred journey. He blessed the boy whose life had reminded him that resurrection always walks beside famine. And he stepped into the sun, the same sun that had not wept for years. His shadow stretched across the stones as he walked. Not hurried, not afraid. Every step was a prophecy. Every breath was an eye. Invitation. The drought still ruled the skies, but something had shifted. The heavens had spoken again, and when Elijah walked with a word in his spirit, even the drought grew nervous. The roads were cracked. The trees bent low. But the prophet's cloak moved like a banner carried by winds no one else could feel. He passed hills where idols stood, and they did not move, did not burn, not yet, but soon. And in the distance the palace shimmered like a wound, gold, guilt, and silence. Ahab would not know what was coming. Jezebel would not feel the tremor in the air, but the heavens did, for Elijah was not just a man now. He was the answer, he was the confrontation. He was the silence that was about to break. The fire that had waited through ravens, through flower, through a boy's final breath, that fire now walked toward its altar. And still the sky did not speak. Not a drop, not a cloud, only heat, only silence, only Elijah. But the drought was almost over. Before fire fell, before altars cracked and rain kissed the earth again, there was a river and there were ravens. And though the world did not see him, heaven did. Elijah was hidden not because he was weak, but because his words had weight. The man who had sealed the skies now lived in their silence. No throne, no temple, only Chariot, the cutting place. There beneath twisted branches and beside slow-moving waters, the prophet lay curled in prayer, with nothing but stone for a pillow and the wind for a witness. And yet the ravens knew. Each morning they came, black as night, gliding like thoughts from the mind of God, bread in their beaks, flesh from the unseen, sent not by nature but by command. And Elijah ate not with doubt but with reverence, for he knew, when the birds obey, the drought is not in control. The Lord is. No one else would have looked for him there. Kings searched cities. Jezebel sharpened threats. But the prophet was not in palaces or in caves. He was in stillness beneath wings. And the silence around him was not emptiness. It was designed. Every day he learned again that sustenance comes not from abundance but from alignment. The same voice that told the sky to shut now told a brook to run, a bird to carry, a man to wait, and all obeyed. And this was the miracle before the miracles, not fire from heaven. It hasn't rained in years, but obedience when no one is watching, faithfulness with no crowd. A prophet beneath trees, whispering prayers with crumbs in his beard, praising a God who hides his servants as carefully as he reveals them. The nights were long. Stars blinked like memories above him. Coyotes cried in the distance. The wind rustled through reeds and leaves like ancient psalms, reciting verses even David had not heard. And Elijah listened, not for instruction but for presence. He did not ask when the rain would return. He did not pace or plead. He sat by the water and let God be God. He had no control and he had no fear, because the ravens still came, because the water still flowed, because the fire in his bones had not gone out, it had only been told to wait. The sun passed overhead like a silent observer, casting long shadows over the stones and the prophet who did not move. His cloak, frayed from journeying and prayer, clung to his shoulders like the wilderness itself had wrapped him in devotion. He did not chase visions, he did not command storms. He only breathed and trusted the rhythm of a God who feeds prophets with birds. Each morning the ravens came. Their wings sliced the wind with ancient grace, their eyes gleamed like secrets, and their beaks bore what no man could explain. Bread from nowhere, meat from the invisible. They came not late nor early, not more, not less. And Elijah, seated by the brook, received without reaching. For those who walk with fire must first learn to be still in famine. No one praised him here. No scrolls recorded his sitting. No song sang of his silence. But the heavens watched, for there is a glory in being hidden. The same God who had fed manna to a nation now fed morsels to a man, not because he had less to give, but because he was teaching Elijah the weight of trust. That miracles are not always thunder. Sometimes they are daily bread in the beak of a bird. Sometimes they are a brook that runs while kingdoms die of thirst. Sometimes they are quiet, the obscurity, the cutting away of what is not needed until only obedience remains. And so Elijah remained. Days melted into weeks and weeks into a deeper silence. The brook hummed beside him like a lullaby from creation's first breath, and the trees whispered above as if Eden had not been forgotten after all. He spoke a few words. Not because he had none, but because every word he had was sacred now, stored for the altar still to come. His voice, once thunder in Ahab's court, had become a still stream in God's wilderness. And in that stream he saw reflections of who he was, who he had been, and what he was yet to become. The world beyond Chariot raged with confusion. Altars to Baal rose like towers of smoke across the land. Jezebel danced her blood hymns in the courts. False prophets multiplied, declaring lies in the name of power. But none of it reached Elijah. He was in the womb of stillness. And even the angels knew that before fire falls, it must first be kindled in hidden places. Before a prophet speaks, he must be silenced by God himself. And so Elijah waited. And the ravens still came. The days began to thin like breath in a long night. The brook, once vibrant and alive, now trickled with hesitation, each drop sounding like a question spoken in a temple of silence. Elijah knelt beside it, his hands cupped in prayer more than thirst, and even as the water grew less, his faith grew deeper. The sky had not changed. It still withheld its mercy, but the prophet had. He had become not just a vessel of flame, but a man acquainted with divine delay. He watched the water recede, not with fear, but with knowing. God does not abandon, he transitions. And when the brook no longer sang, Elijah did not wail. He listened harder. The same voice that had said go would speak again. And so he waited. And the ravens came a little slower now, their wings brushing the branches like final notes in a fading song. There is something sacred in the slow, something holy in the emptying. Elijah, alone yet not lonely, understood what many never do, that when heaven dries a river, it is not judgment but movement. That provision is not always meant to stay but to prepare. The land was still cursed. Jezebel still hunted, but none of that stirred him. The only thing that moved the prophet now was the whisper, and it came, soft but certain, like the breath of a God who never wastes silence. Arise, it said, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. I have commanded a widow there to feed you. A widow, in Sidon, outside the borders of Israel, outside the reach of kings and temples, in the land of idols. And yet that is where the next miracle waited, not in a sanctuary, not in a scroll, but in the dust-stained hands of a grieving woman who had nothing left to offer but her last handful of flour. Elijah rose. The brook behind him fell silent. The ravens flew no more. But something greater had awakened, the next unfolding of obedience, the next door of fire. And so the prophet walked, not into glory but into hunger, not into comfort but into calling. The road to Zarephath was not lined with praise. It was narrow, scorched, and silent. Elijah walked through fields that once bloomed with grain, now brittle as ash. The wind no longer carried songs, only the hollow rattle of emptiness. Yet the prophet did not flinch. Each step was steady, every footfall an echo of obedience. He was not searching for a destination, he was answering a whisper, and heaven watched him move, not because he was strong, but because he surrendered. Sidon was enemy territory, a land where Baal was worshipped and Yahweh was unknown. But Elijah did not walk with fear. He walked with a fire that had learned to wait. He walked with memory in his bones, the memory of a brook that once sang and birds that once brought bread. He walked knowing that where God sends, God sustains, even through the hands of the forgotten. When he reached the city gate, the woman was there, not clothed in grandeur, not crowned with prophecy, just a widow gathering sticks. Her back was bent, her face drawn by hunger. And yet Elijah saw her as heaven did, not as a beggar, but as a vessel. "Bring me a little water in a vessel," he said gently, his voice worn like river stone. And as she turned, he added, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." She stopped, turned back slowly, and spoke not with anger but with truth. "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour and a little oil. I'm gathering 2 sticks so that I may prepare it for me and my son, so that we may eat it and die." Elijah listened not to the despair, but to the doorway inside it, for he knew God hides miracles inside surrender. "Do not fear," he answered. "Make me a cake first, and then for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not fail until he sends rain upon the earth." The woman stared at him, a stranger, a prophet from a God she did not know, yet something in his voice felt like memory. Something in his eyes spoke like a storm that remembered mercy. And somehow, with trembling fingers and an empty jar, she believed. And so Elijah dwelled there, in the house of a widow, beyond the borders of Israel, beside a child who would soon fall sick, then rise again. But that story, that rising, would come later. For now, the prophet who once called drought had become a guest at a humble table. The ravens no longer flew, the brook no longer whispered, but the oil remained, and the flour did not end, and every meal was a prayer that did not need to be spoken. And still the skies remained silent, but Elijah knew the fire was waiting, the rain would come. The heavens were only holding their breath. She had already begun to die when the prophet arrived, not by sword, not by sickness, but by silence. The kind of silence that eats slowly in the corners of the heart, the kind that follows too many empty nights, too many promises broken by the sky. Her husband was gone. Her cupboards are bare. Her child watched her with eyes too quiet for his years, as if he already understood the shape of goodbye. She had no altar, no priest, no offering, only 2 sticks, a little flour, a little oil, and the decision to light one last fire, not to summon help, but to prepare for hunger's end. This was the woman God had chosen. This was the one heaven had seen when the brook dried and the ravens ceased their song. Not a queen, not a warrior, a widow, in Sidon, among the altars of Baal. And yet the Lord had whispered her name when he whispered to Elijah. He had seen her sorrow long before she gathered wood. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro across the earth, and sometimes they rest upon the most forgotten hands. When she saw him at the gate, he did not glow with light. He did not speak in thunder. He was dust-covered and sun-worn, another man with a thirst no well could quench. And yet he asked not for gold, not for shelter, but for water. Then for bread. It was not the request of royalty, but of revelation, and she could have refused. She had a reason, she had her last. But something in his voice, something between grief and glory, struck her spirit like a bell in a darkened temple. So she turned, she poured, and in that moment the silence shifted, not with wind, not with wings, but with memory. For heaven does not only open for armies. Sometimes it opens for ovens. And angels record the moment a widow gives her last to a stranger, believing that God might be hiding inside the hunger. The flour was almost gone. She had seen its bottom, the cold, hollow curve of the jar's end. She knew its weight when full, when hope had once been easy. But now she tipped it with trembling hands and watched as the last of it fell like pale dust into her bowl. Not enough for tomorrow, not even enough for sorrow. And yet she poured. The oil came next, thick and golden, a memory of the sun trapped in liquid light. She tilted the jug, half expecting it to refuse. But it obeyed, a slow stream, a sacred defiance. It glistened as it fell, and though her eyes did not weep, her soul did, not for loss but for the strange warmth rising inside her, the kind that does not come from food but from obedience. She pressed the dough with fingers that had once buried a husband. She shaped it with hands that had held a son through fevered nights. The small cake sizzled against the stone. She flipped it gently, and the scent filled the room like a promise kept. No trumpet sounded. No fire fell, but something holy stood in that kitchen, something ancient, something divine. And when she placed the bread into the prophet's hands, she did not know she was feeding more than a man. She was feeding the fire that would one day call rain from heaven. She was feeding the miracle before the mountain. And heaven recorded every crumb. He ate in silence, not with greed but with reverence, for he knew. He remembered the birds. He remembered the brook. And now he watched the face of this woman, her eyes weary, her lips dry, but her hands still open. He saw in her the same mystery he had met by the river, provision through impossibility. God had not forgot. He had only shifted the source. And from that moment on, the jar never emptied. The oil never ceased. Morning after morning, day after day, the widow reached into what should have been finished and found it full. But she never shouted the miracle. She never ran into the streets. Because true provision is quiet. It arrives like dew, not to be praised but to be trusted. And as the child grew stronger and Elijah dwelled beneath her roof, the air began to change. There was no rain yet. The drought still ruled, but in that house there was bread. There was oil. There was a whisper that God had entered their lack and stayed. But even in the house where miracles hid themselves in jars, sorrow was not a stranger. One night the child coughed once, then again. Sharp, hollow sound, the kind that pulls breath from the very bones of a mother. She sat beside him, pressing cool clothes against his burning skin, whispering lullabies that had no words, only rhythm. Elijah watched from the doorway, the lines on his face deeper than before. He had prayed for rain. He had closed the skies. He had stood before kings without trembling. But now he stood before suffering he could not explain. The boy's chest rose and fell like a candle flickering low. Then it stopped. See. Lents not the silence of peace, the silence of breath that would not return. The widow fell to her knees, her face crumpling into the dust of her floor. Grief poured from her throat, raw and holy. She turned to the prophet with fire in her voice, not anger but anguish sharpened by mystery. "What have you against me, O man of God?" she cried. "Have you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her hands trembled. Her heart broke open. And Elijah, the prophet of flame, took the child in his arms. No words, no defense, only reverence, for even prophets are undone in the face of death. He carried the boy up the stairs. Each step is a prayer, each breath a groan. He laid him on the bed where he himself had once rested, and then he fell beside him. He stretched himself over the child, once, twice, 3 times, and he cried not the cry of thunder, but the cry that only God can hear. "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." No ritual, no magic, just desperation wrapped in faith, and the room held its breath. The walls leaned in, even the silence grew still. Then the child stirred, a single gasp, like wind entering a tent sealed too long. His chest rose, his eyes opened. And the prophet, weeping now, lifted him in awe. He descended the stairs not as a man, but as a vessel of answered prayer. He placed the boy in his mother's arms and whispered, "See, your son lives." And the woman, once crumpled by despair, stood tall in awe. "Now I know," she said, "that you are a man of God and the word in your mouth is truth." But still the drought remained. The skies were unchanged. The fire had not yet fallen, yet something had shifted, not in heaven in them. The boy breathed again. The oil still flowed, and the God who did not speak through thunder. had spoken through bread, through death, and through the breath of a child. Elijah remained in the upper room long after the boy's breath returned. He sat beside the window, watching the horizon without looking for answers. The sky was still bone-dry, stretched taut like an old scroll across the heavens. Clouds wandered, barren and wordless. But Elijah no longer searched them for signs. He had seen resurrection in the breath of a child. He had heard the heartbeat of heaven not in storms, but in the silence after grief. And that was enough for now. Below him, the widow moved through her home like one who had been marked not just by mercy, but by mystery. Her hands, once brittle with fear, now kneaded bread with the rhythm of trust. Each movement is sacred. Each meal a whisper that life had returned where death once slept. The child played in the dust outside, his laughter the only sound brave enough to echo in a land still cursed with thirst. The neighbors saw the boy and asked no questions. Some miracles are not meant to be explained, only carried. And this house, once a tomb of sorrow, had become a vessel, not of riches, not of status, but of memory. A place where heaven had bent low, where a prophet had knelt in dust, and where oil had outlived drought. Elijah would often descend the steps and sit at the table, breaking bread without ceremony. The woman would pour oil without comment, and between them a silence formed not of absence but of presence too great to name. It was the silence of the hidden places, where God chooses not to shout but to remain. And so it was that Elijah dwelled there, not as a guest, but as one who had been folded into the fabric of God's strange provision. Each morning the jar welcomed her hand. Each night the jug did not run dry. And though the land outside withered, though the altars of Baal still smoked across Sidon's hills, though the king of Israel still sat on a throne built on falsehood here in this small house by the gate, there was enough. Not more, never less, just enough. But the prophet did not forget. The drought still pressed upon the people of God. The idols still multiplied like weeds. The time of fire had not yet come, but it would. Elijah could feel it in the ache of his bones, in the way the air waited, in the way silence began to grow heavy with a name he had not spoken since Chariot. Ahab. The command would come, he knew it. The Lord would speak again, not to hide but to reveal, not to wait but to confront. And when that word came, Elijah would rise. He would walk from the house where flour flowed like faith, and he would carry the memory of a widow, a boy, and a table that never ran empty. He would walk toward the mountain, toward the king, toward the altar, toward the fire, but not yet, for now the prophet sat with the quiet. The widow broke bread, the boy lived, and the sky, though dry, watched in stillness, for it knew it would not be dry much longer. The time had come, not with thunder, not with the cry of angels, but with a whisper, the kind that moves beneath the skin and wakes the bones. Elijah rose before the dawn, the widow still asleep, the boy curled beside. The oil jar that had never emptied. He did not speak farewell. He did not pack provisions. He had learned by now, when heaven sends you, heaven feeds you. The air outside was thick with heat, but something deeper stirred beneath it. Not wind, not rain, fire. A fire that had waited. A fire that had listened. A fire that had not yet spoken. And now it stirred on the edge of a prophet's breath. He walked without fanfare, his feet pressing into the brittle skin of a dying land. Dust rose to meet him, clinging to his ankles like shadows. The roads were quiet, but the silence was not empty. It was pregnant with reckoning. 3 years had passed since his voice last shook the throne. 3 years since the rain fell. The idols had grown taller. The altars multiplied, but their gods remained deaf. Jezebel's blade had silenced many, but not all, for truth cannot be killed. It hides, it waits. It burns beneath the surface until the day the mountain calls, and that day had arrived. Ahab was not expecting him. The king, bloated on wine and whispered lies, ruled over a kingdom of famine, blaming everything but himself. His face, once proud, now sagged with desperation. Crops had died, herds had thinned, the rivers had forgotten their names. And still he clung to Baal, offering incense to stone, but the people, they had begun to murmur. They remembered a man once who had spoken to the sky, and the sky had obeyed. And now that man has returned. Elijah did not arrive in royal garments. His cloak was weather-worn, his eyes steady, his voice a blade. "Go," he said to the servants at the gate, "tell your king Elijah is here." And when the message reached Ahab's ears, fear rose beneath his anger. "Is it you, trouble of Israel?" The king spat, cloaking guilt and accusation. But Elijah did not flinch. "I have not troubled Israel," he said, "but you and your father's house, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed Baal." Ahab's silence was a wound. Elijah did not wait for agreement. "Send," he said, "gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." His voice rang like thunder inside a temple long asleep. And though the king burned with hatred, he obeyed, because in his heart even Ahab knew the sky had not spoken since Elijah vanished, and now he has returned. The mountain waited. Mount Carmel stood like a sentinel, its stones weary from years of watching men forget. The trees whispered ancient things. The wind moved, but not with gentleness, with warning. For the fire was near now. It had waited long beneath the crust of time, smoldering not in heavens but in hearts. Elijah stood upon the mountain's spine, his cloak fluttering like a banner of judgment. Below him the people gathered, thousands, their faces hollowed by drought, their eyes flickering between desperation and disbelief. They had brought no offerings, only questions. Their gods had been silent. Their kings had lied. Their fields had died beneath the sky's refusal. And now they stood between two altars, not knowing whom to follow. Then Elijah stepped forward, and his voice rolled down the slopes like thunder wrapped in scripture. "How long will you limp between two opinions?" he cried. "If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." But the people answered not a word. Their silence was not loyalty, it was exhausting. They had bowed so long to lies, they no longer remembered how to stand in truth. And so Elijah alone stood tall. I only am left a prophet of the Lord," he said, "but Baal's prophets are 450 men." The challenge was simple and eternal. 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. "Call upon your God," Elijah said, "and I will call upon the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God." And the people, stirred by the echo of certainty, nodded, "Yes, let it be so." The prophets of Baal stepped forward, adorned in colors and amulets, their eyes bright with false conviction. They danced. They shouted, they bled. From morning till noon they cried, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice. No one answered, no fire, only wind and mockery. Elijah watched, the mountain waited. And when midday passed and the prophets collapsed in exhaustion, he stepped forward, alone, quiet, no drums, no spectacle, just a man and an altar. Broken stones lay scattered across the high place, once holy, now forgot. Elijah knelt and gathered them, 12 stones, one for each tribe, each a memory, each a promise. He rebuilt what had been torn down, not just with hands but with reverence. Around the altar he dug a trench. Upon the wood he laid the sacrifice. Then without fear he called for water, precious, rare, sacred water, and poured it over the altar 3 times, until it soaked the wood, filled the trench, and drenched the sacrifice. There would be no question if fire came, it would not be kindled by men. And then he prayed. He did not shout, he did not dance, he did not cut his flesh or summon spirits. Elijah stood beside the altar, soaked in water and silence, and lifted his eyes to the sky that had not wept in years. And he spoke not to the crowd, not to the king, but to the God who sees in secret. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he whispered, "let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, that these people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." He said no more. He did not command fire, he invited it. And heaven, which had waited in stillness, answered with fury. It fell not like rain, but like judgment, a roar without voice, a flame without warning, fire from heaven. It did not touch gently, it was consumed. the sacrifice gone, the wood ash. The stones scorched. The water vanished into steam and sky. The trench dry as bone, and the people fell, not by command but by awe, faces to the dust, hearts split open by glory. The Lord, He is God, they cried again and again, their voices rising with terror and trembling. The Lord, He is God, not Baal, not Asherah, not the silence of carved mouths, but the one who speaks in fire, the one who had waited, the one who had not forgotten. Elijah stood alone on the mountain's edge, the wind pulling at his cloak. Behind him a nation lay breathless. Before him smoke curled toward heaven like a lifted veil. The fire had come. The altar had answered. And in that sacred silence after the miracle, the prophet did not bask, he remembered. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The fire was only the opening. The rain had not yet fallen. And Jezebel, she still sat on her throne. Her prophets had been slain that day. Her power cracked, her illusion undone. But Elijah knew darkness does not flee quietly. When truth burns, lies scream. And already the echo of her fury was forming in the distance. But the prophet did not turn to run. He knelt once more upon the scorched earth. The people watched. The clouds above remained unbroken. The ground beneath was still dry. But Elijah, who had heard heaven's whisper in famine, now bent again to pray. He bowed low, deeper than before, until his face touched the ground. The fire had fallen, but his spirit reached still higher. He said nothing to the people. He gave no command. He only prayed in silence so full it thundered. His knees dug into the ash-soaked soil of Carmel, his cloak wrapped around his head like the shroud of one mourning the distance between heaven and earth. 7 times he sent his servant to the edge of the mountain. Look toward the sea. And each time the boy returned, his voice the echo of disappointment. There is nothing. But Elijah did not rise. His forehead pressed against the earth, not in defeat, in insistence. He knew. Rain always follows fire, not immediately, but inevitably. And on the 7th time the servant returned, eyes wide with something new. Behold, a cloud, small, no larger than a man's hand, but Elijah stood, because faith does not wait for storms to begin. It moves when the first whisper appears. He turned to the servant, the mountain still steaming behind him. Go, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. The sky, once dry as judgment, now trembled. The wind began to stir. The sea groaned beneath the horizon, and above them all the heavens opened. Darkness rolled in from the west, thick with promise. Thunder grumbled like an old lion roused from sleep. And then rain, heavy, relentless, alive. The first drop struck the dust like blessings, and the earth drank deeply. The same mountain that had burned now wept. The same sky that had withheld now poured. The same people who had doubted now lifted their faces to the storm. But Elijah, he ran. The prophet gathered his robe, and by the hand of the Lord he outran the chariot of Ahab. Feet pounding against soaked earth, wind in his hair, fire still in his lungs. He did not run to escape. He ran because the word moved in him like lightning through dry bone. He ran not toward safety, but toward the next confrontation. Jezebel's shadow already stirred. Her rage would be swift. But for now, the rain fell. The curse was broken, and the fire at last had spoken. The rain did not fall like mercy, it fell like memory, as if the sky had finally remembered what it was made for. As if every cloud had been holding its breath for 3 long years, and now exhaled in tears too heavy for language. The land drank in silence, and the silence was holy. Rivers stirred from their graves. Dust became soil again. Seeds cracked open beneath the flood like old prayers suddenly heard. And across the hills of Israel people stood in doorways and fields, faces turned upward, arms wide. The mouths open not to speak, but to receive. The storm was not a threat. It was a return. But the prophet did not linger beneath the comfort of answered prayer. He ran soaked, spent, and burning. The fire on Carmel had not left his bones, it had only changed form. He ran before the chariot of the king, his feet pounding mud and prophecy into the earth. not as a servant to Ahab, but as a shadow of warning, for where the rain falls, so too must truth descend. Jezebel still ruled. Her prophets now lay dead, but her power had not broken. And though the people bowed to the Lord on the mountain, repentance is not proven in thunder. It is tested in the days that follow, when skies clear and memory fades. And so Elijah ran, not for shelter, not for celebration, but because the Spirit moved in him with urgency. The heavens had spoken, but the earth had not yet responded. The fire had fallen, but the soul of a nation still trembled between two altars. And in that tension, Elijah knew storms cannot save. They can only awaken. Jezreel rose before him, not as a refuge, but as a reckoning. The walls gleamed wet under the rain's new blessing, but the spirit of the city had not changed. Jezebel's throne still stood, high and blood-slick, clothed in silk and silence. And though her prophets were gone, their smoke still clung to her garments. She heard of Elijah's fire, how it had consumed not just the sacrifice, but the lies, and she did not tremble. She smiled, a thin, bitter curve of the mouth. "So he kills my priests," she whispered. "Then let him know what it means to be hunted." She sent her word into the storm like a serpent through tall grass. "Tell him, by this time tomorrow I will make his life as the life of one of them." The message found him as the thunder faded. It came not as a spear, but as a sentence, yet it struck deeper than iron. Elijah, who had faced kings, who had silenced false gods, who had outrun storms, now fled. Not from death, from despair, from the sudden weight of having seen heaven move and still knowing earth could reject it. His cloak, soaked from the storm, now dragged with the dust of the wilderness. His sandals wore down to the flesh. He did not pray, he did not speak. He ran until the voice inside him no longer whispered fire, only fatigue. The land blurred. The memory of victory cracked in his chest like broken pottery, and beneath a solitary broom tree he collapsed. There was no glory there. No altar, just dust. And in that dust Elijah lifted his eyes not to heaven, but to surrender. "It is enough," he whispered. "Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." His breath trembled, his hands shook. The rain had returned, but joy had not. Drought had broken, but so had he. And there beneath the tree, the prophet of fire asked for death. Not because he doubted God, but because the fire had burned everything inside him, and still the darkness chased. But God, who sends fire from heaven, also sends bread in silence. The prophet slept, curled in the dust like a forgotten flame, and the heavens did not scold him. For even fire needs rest. Even those who call down storms must one day lie beneath trees and let the earth hold them. His prayer for death hung in the air, unanswered, not because it was unworthy, but because it was not yet time. And as the sun crossed the sky in silence, something stirred near him. Not thunder, not wind, but presence, soft and steady. A hand touched his shoulder, and a voice like water after drought whispered, "Arise and eat." Elijah opened his eyes, and there beside him, baked on hot stones, was a cake, and near it a jar of water. No ravens this time, no widow, no miracle announced. Just provision, just kindness, just God again. He ate in silence, not with hunger but with need. And when he lay back down, the presence did not leave, it waited. For weariness cannot be healed in haste. And once more the voice returned, not louder, not harsher. "Arise and eat," it said again, "for the journey is too great for you." And Elijah, whose feet had outrun horses and whose words had split the sky, understood. The fire within him had not failed, but it needed fuel. He rose not with triumph, but with trust. And in the strength of that meal he walked 40 days and 40 nights, deeper into the wilderness, deeper into the ache, until he reached the mountain of God, Horeb. There beneath its shadow he found a cave and crawled into its hollow. It was not the comfort he sought, it was nearness. He did not ask for signs, he waited for presence. And the word came, not soft this time, direct. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And the prophet, whose heart had been torn between fire and fear, opened his mouth and let the ache speak. "I have been very jealous of the Lord, for the people have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets. I am alone, and they seek my life to take it away." And he, Avon answered, not with arguments, not with rebuke, but with an invitation. Stand on the mountain before the Lord. Elijah stepped out into the mouth of the cave, his cloak wrapped tight around him like prayer stitched into fabric. The mountain loomed in silence, a throne of stone carved before the flood, and all creation seemed to wait. Then the wind came, violent, roaring. It tore through the rocks, shattered stones into dust, howled like the scream of ancient wars. It passed through trees and bones, through everything that trembles when touched by power. But God was not in the wind. Then came the earthquake, the mountain groaned beneath his feet, the ground split open like the world itself remembered pain. But God was not in the quake. Then fire, blinding, alive. It leapt across the stones, devouring air, the very breath of the earth turned to flame. But God was not in the fire. Then a stillness, so soft it could not be heard with ears, a whisper. Not from wind, not from earth, not from flame, but from the space between. A voice without volume, a presence without form. Elijah felt it more than heard it, and he wrapped his face in his cloak, for the holy had arrived, not to shout, not to strike, but to speak. What are you doing here, Elijah? The voice asked again, not because it did not know, but because it wanted the prophet to remember. And Elijah, trembling, repeated his cry, I have been zealous, I am alone, and they seek my life. But heaven did not confirm his loneliness, nor did it deny his pain. Instead, it whispered instructions. Go, return, anoint Hazael king over Syria, anoint Jehu over Israel, and Elisha, anoint him as prophet in your place. The work was not finished. The fire was not the end. Elijah was not alone. I have reserved 7,000, God said, who have not bowed to Baal nor kissed him. And with that whisper more powerful than earthquake, wind, or flame, the prophet who had fled now turned his face back to the path. The cave had not been an escape. It had been a womb, and the rain that had fallen was only the beginning. There are voices that thunder, voices that shake the earth, part seas, or cast down fire. But the holiest voice Elijah ever heard was the one that did not raise itself at all. It came in stillness, in quiet, in the breath between brokenness and obedience. And when it came, it did not strike him down, it lifted him. He had come to Horeb expecting judgment, expecting the sky to match the storm inside him. But instead, God answered his weariness with a whisper, not to diminish him, but to remind him that heaven's strength is not always loud. Sometimes it moves like a breath, and it is in the breath that true creation begins again. Elijah stepped out from the cave not with a sword, but with a softened heart. The fire in him had not died, it had been refined. And as he began his descent from the mountain, the prophet did not look for thrones or altars. He looked for Elisha, a plowman, a son of the soil, a man whose hands were calloused by labor, but whose spirit had been marked by the gaze of God long before he ever saw Elijah. 12 yokes of oxen moved before him when the prophet arrived, but only one thing would be left standing when Elijah passed by. Without a word, Elijah cast his cloak upon him. A single act, yet it thundered with legacy. That cloak worn by wilderness, soaked by storms, scorched by fire, and wept over by ravens was more than cloth. It was calling. Elisha paused. He looked at the oxen, at the fields, in the past, and then he ran after Elijah. Let me kiss my father and my mother, he said, and then I will follow you. Elijah turned, eyes quiet. Go back again. What have I done to you? But Elisha understood. You do not return from a cloak like that. You burn the plow, you break the yoke, you make the ashes your altar. And Elisha did. He sacrificed the oxen, fed the people, and walked into the fire that had been passed like breath from one prophet to the next. And so they walked, the old flame and the new ember. Elijah ahead, his steps carved by the memory of fire and famine, of caves and storms. Elisha behind, watching the weight of that cloak sway with every stride, the symbol of a mantle he had not yet earned but had already begun to carry in his bones. They spoke little, for prophets do not waste breath. They listened more to the wind, to the earth, to the silence where God hides his instruction. The days passed, and the journey deepened, not in distance but in mystery. It was no longer about reaching places. It was about preparing souls. Elijah did not teach in scrolls. He taught in pauses, in the way his fingers lingered over cracked stones, on the way he lifted his eyes to the hills without asking for answers, on the way he knelt when no one watched. Elisha watched it all, the movements of a man whose soul was tethered to something invisible. He began to understand what the cloak meant. It was not power, it was surrender. It was not applause, it was aching. To carry that fire was to carry the loneliness of one who listens to God when others build idols. It was to eat with widows while kings feast elsewhere. It was to speak truth when truth is unwelcome. And still he followed. In each village they passed, whispers began to rise. "Do you know," the sons of the prophets would say, "that the Lord will take your master from you today?" And Elisha, whose face was now set like flint, answered with reverence and restraint, "Yes, I know, keep silent." For when the holy prepares to lift, the earth must hush. Elijah did not speak of it, but it hung around him like wind before the whirlwind, something unsaid yet undeniable. Even the trees bowed lower as they walked. Even the birds fell silent when he passed. And still, the voice that had broken the wind back on Horeb remained within him. They came to Gilgal, and Elijah turned to the one who followed him like a shadow carved from loyalty. "Stay here," he said softly, "for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha, whose soul had already burned its bridges, answered with the weight of covenant, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went together. At Bethel the whispers rose again. "Do you not know?" the sons of the prophets asked. "Your master will be taken from you today." And again Elisha replied, "Yes, I know, keep silent." He was not resisting grief, he was honoring it. Some departures are too holy to speak of while the sandals still touch soil. Again Elijah tested him. "Stay here," he said at Jericho, "for the Lord has sent me onward." And again Elisha vowed, "I will not leave you." There are moments when following is not submission but sacred defiance, a refusal to let the light go out alone. They crossed into Jericho, and the earth beneath their feet felt thinner, the veil between heaven and earth drawn taut with expectation. 50 sons of the prophets stood at a distance, watching, sensing the heavens, holding their breath. But Elijah and Elisha walked alone, not because they were better, but because they had been chosen for this fire. And one last time Elijah said, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jordan." But Elisha, eyes wet with knowing, said, "As the Lord lives, I will not leave you." And so they came to the river, the same Jordan that had once parted for a nation, that had once cradled the ark, that had heard the voice of God before. Elijah removed his cloak, the mantle, the memory, the fire, and struck the water. It parted, the river bowed, and they crossed on dry ground. They did not speak of the miracle, they walked through it. And when they reached the far side, the prophet of fire turned to his heir. "Ask," he said, "what I shall do for you before I am taken." And Elisha, bold, broken, burning, looked into the eyes of the one he loved and said, "Let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Not because he sought glory, but because he knew what the cloak cost. And Elijah, with a voice that had once silenced kings, whispered, "You have asked a hard thing." "You have asked a hard thing," Elijah said, not because heaven lacked power, but because the fire, once given, could not be taken back. It would burn through marrow and memory. It would consume comfort, crush pride, and demand silence when the world demanded noise. To receive a double portion was not to rise in rank, but to fall deeper into the weight of obedience. Elijah did not promise it. He offered only one thing: "If you see me as I am taken from you, it shall be so." And then they walked, no thunder yet, no wind, just two men, one fading into glory, the other preparing to carry his name in ash and oil. Then the sky cracked, not with rain, not with judgment, but with something older, a rift in time. A chariot of fire appeared, and horses of flame descended like a storm woven from heaven's breath. The whirlwind spun around them, sacred and violent. Light swallowed the air. Fire kissed the stones. And Elijah, the prophet of drought and rain, of silence and flame, was lifted, not buried, not broken, lifted. The earth did not claim him. The grave did not hold him. He rose through the fire as one who never truly belonged to dust. Elisha cried out, not in fear, in love. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. But there was no answer, only flames, only wind, and then stillness. The sky closed again, the whirlwind faded, and there at his feet lay the cloak. The same cloak that had parted waters rested on his shoulders in famine, caught the tears of caves and the dust of mountaintops, now lay still. Elisha tore his garments, not as a ritual but as a release. The old had passed, the mantle remained. And when he picked it up, the fire did not feel like victory. It felt like a vow. He returned to the river, the same river that had opened for his master. He did not shout, he did not plead. He struck the water and whispered, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And the waters answered. They parted again, not for Elijah, for Elisha. And the sons of the prophets watching from afar knew the spirit of Elijah now rested on another. But the voice that had broken the wind, still echoed within him. Long before the chariot split the sky, before the cloak fell, before Elisha tore his robe and walked through parting waters, there was a cave. A narrow hollow in the side of the ancient mountain where the earth had once met the voice of God. Horeb, Sinai, the place where commandments were carved into stone and lightning kissed the summit. But Elijah had not come to inscribe law, he had come to ask why heaven felt so far. The cave did not echo. It swallowed his questions in stone. He lay in its mouth with dust on his lips, his soul curled like parchment burned too many times. The fire on Carmel had come. The rain had returned. But the people, they had not changed. Jezebel still cursed his name. The altars of Baal still smoldered in secret corners. And Elijah, emptied of thunder, whispered to the silence, "It is enough. Take my life, I am no better than those who came before me." The cave did not answer, but then a voice, not from fire, not from whirlwinds, just a question woven through the stillness. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was not an accusation, it was an invitation, a mirror held by mercy. Elijah answered not as a prophet, but as a wounded child. "I have been very zealous for the Lord," he said, "but the people, they have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets. I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." It was not just grief, it was loneliness soaked in obedience. And heaven did not argue. He was told to stand on the mountain and wait, not for a reply, but for revelation. He stood at the mouth of the cave, the stone cold beneath his feet, the wind curling through his cloak like the breath of something ancient. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the ache of standing too close to something holy. The sky began to stir. First, a wind, not a breeze, not a sigh, but a roar. It howled across the mountain, tearing through trees, shattering rock, rending the air as if the breath of creation had been released again. The earth quaked in its bones, but Elijah stood still, unmoved, for the voice was not in the wind. Then fire, bright, wild, alive, dancing on the edges of stone, searing the air with memory. The same fire that had licked the altar on Carmel, the same fire that had separated the chariot from earth. And yet, the voice was not in the fire. Then stillness, not silence, stillness. That deep, trembling quiet that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the nearness of something too great to speak. It moved like a breath behind a veil, a still, small voice, a whisper. And in that moment Elijah wrapped his face, not from fear, from knowing. The God who speaks in fire also speaks in the whisper. The God who parts seas, who rends heavens, who feeds prophets by ravens and widows and miracles, now speaks with the gentleness of breath pressed to skin. That is how heaven answered the ache, not with a storm but with presence. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The whisper asked again. And again the prophet poured out his heart, word for word as before, but this time the echo did not return empty. The Lord did not explain, he commissioned. "Go," he said, "return. Anoint Hazael king over Syria, Jehu over Israel, and Elisha as prophet in your place." He did not soothe Elijah's fears, he gave him purpose. And then the quiet mercy. "I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him. You are not alone. The whisper had not come to comfort his despair. It had come to reveal that he had never been abandoned. And when Elijah stepped back from the mouth of the cave, he did not leave lighter, he left deeper. The whisper had not removed his burden, it had sanctified it. He walked down the side of Horeb not with answers, but with anointing. The silence still clung to him, not as emptiness, but as echo. It followed in his footsteps, wrapped around the hem of his garment, breathed between each step like a vow remembered in dust. He did not rush. Prophets do not rush when they walk with the voice that breaks wind and flame. Every stone beneath his feet felt holy now, not because it sang, but because it had held him when he had nothing left to give. The wilderness did not change. The world did not suddenly soften. But Elijah had heard the breath of God, and once a man hears that, he walks through famine like Eden waits on the other side. His eyes, once burdened by the sight of burning altars and broken people, now saw differently. He no longer looked for the loud. He listened for the small, the still, for he had learned the deepest truth a prophet can carry. The presence of God is not always in the flame sometimes. It is in the voice that trembles the soul without raising its volume. Elisha waded ahead, plowing fields, unaware that a mantle soaked in wind, dust, and fire was about to fall across his shoulders. Kings would be anointed. Nations would turn. But none of that compared to the moment when the cave became a sanctuary, not because of what God did, but because of how gently he spoke. The cave where Elijah once begged to die would now live forever in the memory of heaven, the place where despair met whisper and was transformed. He passed the stones where he had once laid down in surrender, now with new weight in his steps, not the weight of sorrow, but the weight of being sent. Elijah did not ask again if his life should end. The whisper had quieted that question forever. The voice had not argued with his pain. It had simply moved into it like light slips into a room too dark for explanation. And now the prophet walked not with answers but with instructions. There is a holiness in being sent after silence. It is not the sending of noise or of triumph, but of a heart that has been held by God and heard. Elijah was that heart now, softened, sharpened, still burning. He walked from Horeb to Damascus. Through wastelands, through windswept fields, through cities that did not know a prophet passed among them. He walked past altars that still bled to false gods, past children who had never seen rain. And yet he walked with the memory of the cave still breathing inside him. The whisper had not left. It lived in the beat of his heart. It rose with him in the morning and folded around him in the night. And when he came to Hazael, he anointed him, not with judgment, but with obedience. When he found Jehu, he did the same. And finally, he returned to Elisha, the one plowing a field as if it were soil alone, not destiny. He cast the cloak again, but this time he did not speak. He did not need to. Elisha knew. The field was no longer home. The plow no longer fit. He broke the yoke, burned the wood, and cooked the oxen, turning the tools of his old life into the altar of his new one. Elijah watched, not with pride, with promise. The fire was passing, but it was not fading. And somewhere far behind him, the cave still waited, holding the whisper that had saved a prophet who thought he was alone. It began with a whisper, but it would continue with fire. The cloak did not fall by accident. It was not tossed aside. It descended with purpose, drawn from heaven by obedience and anchored to earth by legacy. When Elijah was taken, he left no monument, no tomb, no inscription carved in stone, only the cloak. That weathered fabric bore the scent of ravens and rain, the dust of famine roads, the salt of tears cried beneath broom trees and beside dying children. It had touched altars soaked in water. It had parted rivers. It had been pressed to the prophet's face the moment the whisper passed by. And now it rested in the hands of Elisha. The younger prophet stood by the banks of the Jordan, his master gone in flame and whirlwind, the air still crackling with what had just happened. He did not weep like a student, he cried like a son. my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." But only silence answered, and the wind carried the dust of departure into his open palms. Then his hands closed around the cloak, and in that moment something eternal settled on his shoulders. He returned to the river, the same river they had crossed not long before, the same water that had parted for a prophet wrapped in purpose. Elisha held the cloak, his breath catching like thunder trapped in the chest. He struck the river, not with doubt, not with certainty, but with inheritance. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked, not as a question of absence, but as a summons of presence. The waters answered. They moved again, split again, and he walked through not as a servant, but as the one who now carried the fire. The sons of the prophets watched from a distance and whispered what heaven already knew. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. They came to meet him, the sons of the prophets, those who had once stood at a distance while the heavens opened and fire drank the altar dry. Now they bowed before Elisha, not out of fear but reverence. They saw in his eyes the storm that had once followed Elijah's footsteps, but it was quieter now, less like lightning, more like a slow-burning lamp that would not go out. "Let us search," they pleaded. "Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has cast your master upon a mountain or into a valley." Elisha said no. He knew what they did not. The whirlwind does not abandon, it carries. But they insisted. 50 men scoured the hills and ridges for 3 days, looking for what heaven had already taken. They returned empty, as all who search for prophets in graveyards will. Elisha said nothing more. He only turned back toward the city, and the cloak moved with him. Jericho greeted him not with celebration but with decay. "The city is pleasant," they told him, "but the water is bad and the land brings death." And Elisha, the one now wrapped in legacy, did not wait for thunder. He asked for a new bowl and salt. No spectacle, no flame, just a whisper of the holy through action. He went to the spring, poured the salt, and said with the calm authority of one who had once followed fire, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water." And it was done. Not because of the salt, but because of the cloak, the presence, obedience. From that day life returned to what had been cursed, but not all honored him. In Bethel children came mocking, laughing at the mantle, sneering at the baldness of the prophet who now walked in the shadow of Elijah. "Go up, you bald head." They jeered as if fire was a fable and chariots a myth. But heaven heard, not because Elisha was fragile, but because reverence is not a suggestion, it is a boundary. And when the bears came from the woods, it was not vengeance. It was a reminder. The prophets may pass, but the God who sends them does not forget who mocks what is holy. And Elisha walked on, not just as a man, but as the generation that came next, with the cloak now heavy on his shoulders and the fire resting beneath his silence. His feet carried him where Elijah had never walked, yet the fire within him spoke the same language. The cloak did not make him a replica, it made him a continuation. For the Spirit does not preserve men, it preserves the message. Elisha moved through cities hollowed by drought and kingdoms ruled by pride, and wherever he walked, the memory of the whirlwind lingered. He brought no army, no scrolls, no crown, only the same stillness Elijah had carried out of the cave. And with that stillness came power, quiet, precise, and irrevocable. Poor widow, trembling under the weight of her dead husband's debt, came to him. Her sons were about to be taken, sold for silver, and she had nothing left but a jar of oil. The world would have dismissed it. Elisha did not. He looked at her not with pity but with prophecy. "Borrow vessels," he said, "not a few." And she obeyed. She poured, and the oil did not stop. Jar after jar, vessel after vessel, until the last one was full. Then it ceased. Not a moment before, not a drop wasted. She sold the oil, paid the debt, and lived. The miracle was not in the oil. It was in her faith to gather emptiness. Elisha did not wave his hands. He spoke, and the oil obeyed. For when the cloak passes, even the unseen recognizes the voice it carries. He journeyed on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman perceived the fire behind his eyes. She made room for him not just in her house, but on her roof, building a chamber, placing a bed, a table, and a lamp. And when he asked what could be done for her, she asked for nothing. But the fire sees what we dare not speak. This time next year, he said, you shall embrace a son. And the promise came true. A child born of silence and generosity, nestled in the arms of a mother who had long stopped praying for such things. The cloak had not just passed, it had multiplied, and still the fire burned. But fire does not come without testing. One morning the promised child cried out in the fields, his head bowed under invisible weight, and by evening he was gone. The Shunammite mother, once filled with laughter, now folded in grief. She did not scream. She did not bury him. She laid him on the prophet's bed, the place where fire once rested, and she saddled her donkey in silence. All is well, she told the servants, not because it was, but because she refused to speak death over a child given by the voice that had never lied. She rode until she saw Elisha in the distance, and when she reached him, she fell to his feet. Did I ask for a son? She wept. Did I not say, do not deceive me? And Elisha, whose soul now carried both inheritance and ache, sent Gehazi ahead, but she clung to him. I will not leave you. The same words he had once spoken to Elijah now returned to him, carved in a mother's agony. And so he went, entered the house, closed the door, and prayed. He stretched himself over the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. A prophet breathing fire back into the promise. The flesh grew warm. Then the child sneezed not once but 7 times. The air filled with life again. Elisha opened the door and called the mother. Take your son, he said. No explanation, no spectacle, only resurrection. The cloak had passed not as a memory but as a mission. And in that chamber the same spirit who had once called down fire now breathed into a new generation not just miracles but mercy. Elisha did not speak of Elijah often. He did not need to. The whirlwind lived in his silence. The mantle moved in his stillness. The voice that broke the wind had not vanished. It had found another who would carry it, not to command, but to serve. And so the fire went on. There are some who leave footprints in the dust, and there are others who leave none because they are lifted. Elijah did not die. The earth did not cradle his bones. No tomb bears his name, no grave holds his fire. For he was taken in a way that defies the language of men. It was not a farewell, it was a rising. A chariot appeared, carved from flame and mystery, drawn by horses no pasture had ever known. It did not gallop. It tore through the veil between heaven and earth like lightning wrapped in covenant. And Elijah, the man of storms and silence, stepped into it as if he had always belonged in fire. There was no warning, no time to explain. Elisha stood near, the one who had never left his side, and his eyes saw what the world was never meant to witness. The fire didn't burn him, it revealed him. Elijah rose not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man whose obedience had made him too light for the grave. The whirlwind roared around them. Mountains shook in reverence. And Elisha wept not from fear, but from love that knew heaven had reached for the one it could no longer wait for. My father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. He cried, as fire lifted his teacher beyond what feet could follow. The prophets searched the mountains for days, refusing to believe what fire had done. But Elisha knew. The one who had walked through drought, stood alone on Carmel, rested in the cave, and whispered with God. He had not been taken by death. He had been taken by God himself. The earth closed quietly behind him, not in mourning, but in awe. For how does dust weep for one it could never hold? Elijah was not buried because he had already laid himself down long before the chariot came. In every famine he endured, in every silent night beside a drying brook, in every whispered surrender beneath broom trees and inside caves, he had given himself to the Lord. His offering was not in his death, but in his obedience. And so, when the time came, there was no grave, only glory. The whirlwind carried him where chariots made of human hands could not ride. The fire did not consume him. It revealed what had always burned inside him. Elisha stood beneath the silence left in his master's wake, the sky slowly stitching itself closed. No angel descended with explanation. No echo of the chariot remained, just the cloak heavy with memory. He held it not like a trophy, but like a wound soft with grief, blazing with inheritance. There were no words for what he had seen, only that it changed everything. To watch a man lifted into the heart of heaven is to know that fire waits for those who walk with it. Elisha tore his garments not from despair, but from reverence. His old life could not remain, not now, not after that. The sons of the prophets still searched hills that held no bones, combed valleys that kept no ashes. Perhaps the Spirit dropped him, they said, on some distant peak or hidden ravine. But Elisha knew, fire does not fall to be gathered again. It rises, it returns to its source. And Elijah, he had returned, not to the cave, not to the wilderness, to the presence from which the whisper first came. And yet his story was not over, for the fire he carried now burned in another. And heaven, though it had lifted Elijah, had not lifted the calling. It had simply passed it forward. Elijah had vanished into glory, but the earth still echoed his name. The wind remembered how it once carried his prayers. The mountains, how they once trembled beneath his feet. The ravens, how they once fed him when no one else would. And Elisha, now cloaked in what he once followed, carried the weight of that memory like fire stitched into his skin. The world around him went on, but the veil had been thinned. He had seen a man lifted beyond dust. He had seen heaven tear open not in wrath, but in welcome. And once you have seen that, nothing else can satisfy you. Not thrones, not victories, only presence. But Elijah was not merely a man taken, he was a man promised to return. His story did not end in the whirlwind. Malachi would write it years later, long after fire had cooled and empires had risen. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. The people would carry that verse in their bones like a candle kept in the dark. For if he returned once in fire, he would return again in voice. In John, crying in the wilderness. In the shadow of Jordan. In the one who prepared the way for the Lamb. But before prophecy unfolded, Elisha lived. He walked the same paths, heard the same wind, saw the same broken altars. And yet the fire had changed him. He no longer feared the silence. He no longer doubted the slow work of God, because he had seen how heaven lifts its prophets not in shame but in glory. Elijah was gone but not lost. The sky had claimed him, but the earth still bore his echo, and Elisha would carry it forward. And so Elisha walked beneath skies that had once opened to fire, beneath clouds that had once borne no rain, with sandals coated in the dust of his master's memory. Yet he did not walk in the shadow of Elijah, he walked in the light of the God who took him. He touched the waters and they parted. He healed springs and they lived. He raised the dead and calmed the cursed, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a voice now tethered to the same whisper that once found Elijah in the cave. The cloak did not just carry power, it carried posture, a bending, a yielding, a fire that did not consume but refined. And those who met Elisha met more than a prophet, they met a man who had seen the chariot no one else could follow. And still the people whispered, could he return? Could a man lifted in flame walk the earth again? In secret corners of synagogues and hearts, mothers told sons, fathers told daughters Elijah would come again. He would not be forgotten like dust. He would be remembered like dawn. They did not wait for a tomb to break open. They waited for fire to descend once more, for a voice in the wilderness, for a turning of hearts. And when John came, robed not in flame but in camel's hair, not calling down fire but preparing the way, they remembered. Are you Elijah? They asked. And though he said no, the echo within him said otherwise. For what is Elijah but a voice crying in the wilderness? What is Elijah but the fire that prepares the path for something greater than fire? The chariot had risen, but the story had not yet ended. It is written that the fire never truly left, that though Elijah was taken in flame, the flame itself remained hidden in the folds of time, waiting for the breath of God to call it forward again. The prophet said he would come before the day of the Lord, not as thunder, but as a voice soft, searing, ancient. And so the people watched the horizon, scanning every stranger who cried in the wilderness, listening for that cadence of holy defiance that could split altars and turn kings pale. And then he came, not Elijah, but a man in his echo, John, a prophet clothed not in power but in hunger. His words were not poetic. They were sandpaper, rough, true, and needed. "Prepare the way of the Lord," he cried. "Make straight his paths." And those with ears to hear heard fire behind his voice. He did no miracles, called no rain, raised no widow's son. Yet the people felt it, the cloak, the warning, the wind of repentance. And when they asked, "Are you Elijah?" he answered, "No, but heaven said otherwise. For it was said of him, if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come." Not the same bones, not the same breath, but the same fire passed forward, not in form but in function, to prepare, to turn, to shake the hearts of men so the Lord could enter without obstacles. But still it was only a shadow, a prelude. For there is another day still written in the scrolls of time, a day not yet born, when the fire will return not as warning but as witness. And on that day, it is said, Elijah will walk again, not in mystery but in clarity, not beside kings but before the King. And the heavens will not whisper, they will roar. And the whirlwind will carry not just a prophet but a generation. And so the fire waits, not behind clouds or altars, not in caves or cloaks, but in time itself. It is not gone, it is folded, held in the breath between the present and the final trumpet. The prophets do not lie. Elijah shall come, not as a memory but as a messenger once more, not to call down fire but to reveal who the fire has always pointed to. For the chariot that once lifted him was not the end of his story. It was only an interruption. His voice has not gone silent. It has only grown distant, like thunder still on the far side of the mountain. But it is coming. And when it returns, it will not prepare the way for judgment alone. It will prepare the way for glory. Some say he will come with another, the witness of the law beside the witness of the fire. Moses and Elijah, together again. The one who climbed Sinai to receive the word, and the one who climbed Carmel to defend it. The two who stood beside Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration, radiant in borrowed glory, speaking not of crowns, but of his departure, his exodus through suffering. They were there, not as ghosts, but the prophecy was fulfilled. Elijah, who had never tasted death, standing beside the one who would drink it for the world. And still the fire waited. It waits not in fear, but in promise. For the last time it comes, it will not leave behind drought or dust. It will consume deception, tear open the sky, and make way for the King who comes not with whirlwinds, but with wounds. The Lord himself, the one Elijah longed for in the silence, the one he heard in the still small voice, will come riding not a chariot of fire, but a wit. A horse, eyes burning with flame. And when he comes, he will not ask where the prophets were buried, for some, like Elijah, left no grave. He will not ask who wore the cloak, but who carried the fire. For the mantle has never been about fabric. It has always been about faith. The kind that stands alone on a mountain when a nation bows to idols. The kind that prays for rain when the sky is still brass. The kind that listens to whispers when wind and earthquake fail to speak. That fire is what returns, not as a flicker but as a flood. And the sons of the prophets will no longer watch from afar, they will rise. And the daughters will prophesy. And the old men will dream dreams again, and the young will see visions. The spirit of Elijah, not as a man but as a movement, will rest upon the final generation like flame upon sacrifice. This fire is not meant to destroy but to reveal. It will burn away the false, the hollow, the dead things dressed in devotion. It will expose the altars built in secret to gods that never speak. It will call down glory not with vengeance, but with mercy. For the same God who sent fire to consume a sacrifice on Carmel now sends fire to consume hearts, so they may live. This is the fire that does not burn houses but builds temples. The fire that does not fall with wrath, but with love so fierce it scorches every lie. And when Elijah returns, in whatever form heaven has ordained, he will not come to be remembered. He will come so that no one forgets what it means to listen, to wait, to follow the voice that speaks in silence, to believe that chariots still split skies and that dust is never the final word. For the fire always returns to the altar, and so it ends not with death but with desire, a longing that has lived in the bones of every generation who ever looked up and wondered if the sky might open again. Elijah did not die because his life had already been swallowed by something greater. He walked with God through famine, through fire, through silence, until the boundary between earth and heaven became too thin to hold him, and the whirlwind came, not as an escape, but as a witness. That obedience burns brighter than legacy. That stillness is not weakness. That one man, wrapped in dust and flame, can carry a nation's turning on his shoulders, but the cloak, the fire, was never meant for one. It was always meant to be passed, from Cherith to Zarephath, from Carmel to Horeb, from Elisha to the trembling hands of those who still believe. It moves now not through prophets alone, but through all who hear the whisper, all who say, "Here I am," even when caves feel safer than mountains. The fire returns wherever hearts are willing to be still long enough to hear the voice that breaks wind and flame. The fire returns in every soul who kneels before truth when the world demands compromise. The fire returns in the quiet eyes of a widow with nothing left to give. The fire returns when altars are rebuilt, not of stone but of surrender. Elijah is not a relic, he is a reminder that the fire of God is not always loud, but it is always near. And one day when the sky splits again, when the trumpet sounds and the world trembles, perhaps he will walk once more beside the one whose face once shone on the mountain. Perhaps the chariot will descend again, not for escape, but for fulfillment. And the fire will no longer need to fall, for it will live fully, forever, in the presence of the one from whom it first came.